Chapter 28. Sunrise. Havilah was hoping the noise she heard was Gideon somehow using his semblance nearby, and readied herself to move fast in case she found herself in his line of fire. She knew his combat techniques as well as her own at this point, so it didn't worry her as much as it used to. What did concern her was that while she evaded and leapt from whatever solid ground she could find to keep the Grimm disoriented, Daniel still kneeled motionless before the now empty throne. That also concerned her. He may have looked like Gideon, but he most certainly didn't fight the same way. Another head turned itself towards her, and she thrust a knife between its eyes to vault herself over it and continued her maneuver. This plan, like all, did not survive first contact with the enemy. This was the first time she actually immersed her weapon into the beast apart from the initial launch that put her where she was now. Grimm's flesh was all too familiar material she had experienced with cutting. This was different. It molded itself around her weapon like low-viscosity tar and found it pulling her back to the place she least wanted to be. The heads she now counted as 6 from where she was looking reared themselves up as the head she hung on began to dematerialize and became a pool that she sunk into. First her hands and feet became immersed, then her tail and waist. The head hadn't struck yet, but her position was vulnerable and was not where she wanted to stay. She thrashed and yelled, but all in vain, as her athleticism and speed proved useless to where she now was.
Leia!
Havilah tried to turn back, hoping Olivia had seen something she didn't.
Daniel's waking up!
Havilah yelled back, turning back and forth to the heads that still eyed her but hadn't yet ended her.
That doesn't help me right now!
A small earthquake and an ungodly noise echoed through the valley, drawing the attention of the monster, whose attention was drawn to the malice it apparently found there. Before it impulsively made its way to chase after it, a greater source of negative emotion called it back to reality. Abimelech made his way to his throne, and his aura flickered towards the beast in a way that apparently it understood. It returned to keeping Havilah captive as his master took his seat. Olivia began to drag her friend away from him, and he hung limp like a lifeguard carrying a drowning victim. Her strength finally spent, she fell back with Daniel, a lifeless husk beneath her. Looking her direction, another series of flickers emanated from his aura that called down a Beowulf alpha from the nearby cliffs. In an instant, she rolled her friend out of the way of the beast's landing and vanished without a trace. The Grimm turned to find the prey that had been promised her, and roared when it escaped his grasp. Another flicker came from the one on the throne, apparently calming the beast, and sent it on its way. Letting out a slow breath, he gestured back to Charybdis and caused him to bring Havilah down to where he could look at her. He reached out his hand to take her cheeks between his fingers. She instinctively tried biting them, but found only rocks to bite. A small giggle at her defiance was only compounded by the look of horror she expressed when seeing Gideon lying unconscious at the center of the now annihilated camp. She looked back in anger, but no words were spoken, just the raw emotion that disdained everything he had done. His claw tapped her on the nose. "Oh, don't look at me like that. We have a lot in common. We both did our homework on our enemies before we fought. The problem is that I aimed for your boys first. And do you honestly think I'm the kind of man who's going to be killed by a woman?" The moment he spoke those words, a small chord sounded like it was struck above their heads, and a rock the size of a millstone was catapulted towards where he sat. Without the opportunity to call out to his queen and give his incredibly heavy body the ability to move, the rock smashed through the headrest of his throne and launched him onto the ground, crushing his head underneath. Charybdis recoiled at the sight of his master slain and began to thrash and bubble in panic. Without direction and eventually even without substance, the mass of liquid flesh returned to its natural state and revealed itself to be a geist marionetting the bodies of its fellow beasts in one collective form. It apparently wasn't smart enough to hold this form without direction from the one that now lies slain and fled in his vulnerable state. A gunshot resounded from the cliffs above them, and the streak of dust hit the monster directly through the head, rendering it out of existence in an eye blink. The fluid flaked away to nothing around Havilah until the point where she could move, and watched as Olivia used what was left from the trap she had set to assist in her descent. Looking her friend in the eye, they both let their glances fall to the men that now needed their help. With a thankful hook to her shoulder, Havilah made her way to get Gideon as Olivia ran to comfort Daniel. She saw him still lying as she left him, but at least fully conscious. Slinging her rifle off of her shoulder and casting it aside, she broke into a run that gave away her position to her target. Daniel's glassy eyes noticed Olivia coming at him and made a futile attempt to sit himself upright. She didn't care if he was prepared. She launched herself in a full tackle that more hurt her than the one she was aiming for. They both let out a forced breath, and a series of dinks sounded off of his breastplate. Small arms balled into fists, hitting him over and over again. Yet those aren't what drew his attention. A small series of water drops collected near where the fists were hitting him, and at first he didn't realize what they were. He was still in so much pain, and his mind couldn't call himself to process even where he was, let alone how to comfort the one weeping on top of him. Words were being spoken over and over again that he had forgotten the meaning of. Olivia wasn't stopped by his inactivity. She kept saying it over and over again.
Dummy, 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 you big dummy.
One last blow then caused her to collapse on top of him and just lie there as her back heaved without actual sobs or crying to follow. Her sharp breath still went unnoticed, and she wiped away the trickle of fluid that had begun to collect below her nose. She looked around for his hammer and found it was still in his hand. She reached out to help secure it more in his grip and found it was still hot. She looked back at Daniel and tried to get his attention.
Are you there, Daniel? What do you want? The bad guy got smushed by a girl. Talk about embarrassing, right?
Nothing.
Come on. Firebranch needs you. Team Gold needs you.
Daniel groaned and finally gained the strength to lift himself up. I don't need you, Olivia, he groaned.
And I don't need you, Olivia replied without a hint of offense taken. That's not the point. We're here to help each other, and that's the choice I've made.
Daniel let out another strained breath. Choices. Do you have any idea how much pain can be inflicted by people's choices? She wasn't pushed away.
A great deal, I'm sure. But like the pain we're enduring now, it's worth it if it means we can keep the promises we've made to each other.
Daniel let his shoulders fall. And those are? He asked. Before an answer could be given, it became apparent that Gideon's onslaught had only devastated the southern end of the camp, and the few survivors had made their way to a mounted gun at the northernmost end of the camp. A hail of fire came their way, and Olivia realized she had thrown aside her rifle and couldn't respond in kind. Despite his mental state, he instinctively put his body between the gunfire and the woman looking for a place to hide. Her eyes lit up and light began to return to his own. There was undeniably a great deal of pain flaring across his back, and even his cloak couldn't absorb all of the energy being hurled his direction. Havilah noticed the gunfire, but was almost a half-mile away from their position and needed to find Gideon a place to hide in case there were more. With every single blow forced on his back, his memory continued to flash on repeat with Olivia in the backdrop. The more pain he withstood, the more she came into view more than what he had been through before. The suffering back then was to entertain the misguided hopes of a murderer looking to undo his crime. Where he looked to bring his family back to life, he suddenly realized he was protecting his now. With his semblance flaring but not breaking, he turned to face it head-on. At that moment, he made a choice. The pain he had been through wasn't worthless. His ability to survive that pain wasn't meaningless. It brought him to where he was now. He couldn't change others' decisions, but he had now decided to defy the choices being made that put the ones he loved in danger. He took his first step. The fire continued to pour across his face and chest. He began to walk against it. The incessant force continued to pelt and dent his armor until it finally fell off. He broke out into a full run. He was in agony, but his only thoughts were to the one he was now remembering more than the weight of the pain of his past. He was an arm's length away from the barrel, and the bandit continued shooting. He brought back his hammer and roared as it ignited and began spewing flames of its own. All the pain in the universe was now meaningless compared to what he had now chosen to live for. The hammer arced upwards and shattered the barrel entirely, causing the trail of fire to ignite the dust ammo stores and vaporize the last surviving bandit in the camp to nothing. He breathed heavily as his aura finally flickered out, and his semblance kept the flames on his scar from gaining any purchase on his flesh. Olivia didn't even retrieve her gun, and for the second time today, tackled Daniel to the ground. Hugging him more for the sake of comfort and thanks than the fact his body has been heated up more than it ever had been in his life, he returned the embrace and whispered a question into her ear. Havaliah finally closed the distance and found the problem had been dealt with. Turning her head slightly to the side, she heard Olivia say, "Yes," and continued to embrace him. She smiled and rested her knives on her hips and decided to leave them alone. The airship wouldn't be here for another 10 minutes anyway. She went back to where she had hidden Gideon's unconscious body and allowed herself to entertain a similar image. The sun was finally rising, and their ride home could be seen silhouetted by the sun. Olivia and Daniel heard the ship approaching and sat themselves upright to take in the sunrise. He then turned to his now fiancée and said, "I guess we'll start with this one," and leaned forward to rest his forehead on her own. Rising to his feet and gathering his broken armor, Olivia bounced over to Havaliah with a very wide grin on her face. The grin unfortunately fell when she saw Gideon twitching and thrashing in his sleep. She looked over to Havaliah. "What's wrong with him?" She shrugged and punched her friend on the shoulder in congratulations. "He's sleeping. First time I've ever seen him this peaceful." The ship landed and they made their way on board. Setting Gideon down in his seat and allowing him to rise at his own time, they rested from the long night they all had. Gideon's scroll began to buzz in his satchel, and Havaliah did him the courtesy of picking up for him. "Yes, instructor?" Daniel and Olivia had already fallen asleep next to each other. Havaliah's brow furrowed as she listened to their new orders. With a grunt, she hung up and placed the scroll back in her friend's bag and thought for a moment of imitating her friends in the seats behind them. After what she had just heard, however, she decided better of it and decided to lean on the window before drifting off to sleep herself.